The road stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolate American Midwest. Jake "Red" Matthews, a seasoned trucker with over 2 decades behind the wheel, had seen it all, or so he thought. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to encounter on this godforsaken night. The sun had set hours ago, and now the only light came from the beams of his headlights piercing the thick darkness. The radio played faint country tunes, but the signal was weak, filled with static. He could feel the weight of fatigue settling in his bones, his eyes growing heavy, but the need to deliver his cargo kept him going. After all, he was known for never missing a deadline, no matter what. As the clock ticked past midnight, the landscape became increasingly barren. No houses, no other vehicles, not even a gas station in sight. Just an endless expanse of fields under a moonless sky. Red felt a chill creep into the cab of his truck, even though the heater was cranked up. The dashboard lights flickered momentarily, and the engine emitted a strange, almost imperceptible hum. But he shrugged it off as nothing more than the truck's age showing. After all, his old Peterbilt had seen better days. The road was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But then, something caught his eye, a figure, standing by the side of the road. A hitchhiker. Out here, in the middle of nowhere. Red squinted through the windshield, trying to get a better look. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one, dressed in a long, flowing dress that seemed out of place for the setting. Her face was obscured by shadows, but she stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something, or someone. Against his better judgment, Red slowed down. He wasn't the type to pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the dead of night, but there was something about her that drew him in. He couldn't explain it, but it felt almost like he had no choice in the matter. As the truck rolled to a stop, the woman began to move towards the cab, her steps slow and deliberate. Red's heart pounded in his chest. There was something off about her, something that set every instinct in his body screaming to drive away. But before he could make up his mind, she was already at the passenger door. She didn't knock, didn't even try to open the door. Instead, she just stood there, staring at him through the window. Her eyes. Red felt a shiver run down his spine. Her eyes were completely black, voids that seemed to swallow the light. Red's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, though he couldn't explain why. It was like he was being controlled, his actions no longer his own. The door creaked open, and the woman silently climbed into the cab. The air inside the truck grew frigid, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Red could see his breath fog up in the air. The woman didn't say a word. She just sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, her face turned towards the windshield. Red's mind raced. What was he supposed to do now? Ask her where she was headed? But the words stuck in his throat. Minutes passed in silence. The radio, which had been playing faintly in the background, suddenly cut out, replaced by a low, droning static. Red tried to change the station, but nothing worked. He glanced at the woman out of the corner of his eye. She hadn't moved, but her presence was suffocating. It felt like the darkness inside her was leaking out, filling the cab with an oppressive weight. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Do you believe in fate, Red? Red jerked back in his seat, his eyes widening in shock. How did she know his name? He hadn't introduced himself, hadn't even spoken a word since she got in the truck. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his blood rushing in his ears. What did you say? He stammered, his voice barely audible. Fate, she repeated, turning her head to face him. Her black eyes bored into his soul, making him feel exposed and vulnerable. We all have a path we must follow, no matter how hard we try to avoid it. Red's throat was dry, his hands clenching the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. I don't know what you're talking about, lady. Where do you need to go? She smiled then, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, sinister. I'm already where I need to be, Red. The question is, are you? The truck continued down the road, but Red felt like he was driving into a void. The darkness outside seemed to close in, the road disappearing behind him as if he was the only person left in the world. Panic set in. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He needed to get rid of her, get her out of his truck, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bring himself to pull over. Suddenly, the woman began to hum a tune, a haunting melody that filled the cab with an eerie sense of dread. It was a lullaby, one that Red vaguely remembered from his childhood, but the notes were distorted, twisted into something unrecognizable and sinister. As the humming grew louder, the truck started to shudder violently. The steering wheel jerked in his hands, and the dashboard lights flickered erratically. Red's vision blurred, the road ahead wavering like a mirage. He was losing control, not just of the truck, but of his mind. The woman's voice echoed in his head, drowning out his thoughts. You can't escape, Red. This is your destiny. Desperation clawed at him. He slammed his foot on the brake, but the truck didn't slow down. It was as if it had a mind of its own, curdling down the road at breakneck speed. The woman's laughter filled the cab, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The truck came to a screeching halt, the force throwing Red against the steering wheel. Gasping for breath, he looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman was gone. He was alone in the truck, the door on her side wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. Red's heart raced as he scrambled to close it, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He looked out into the night, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had never been there at all. Red didn't dare move for what felt like hours. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. What had just happened? Had he imagined it all? No, it was too real, too vivid to be a mere hallucination. Gathering what little courage he had left, Red started the truck again. The engine roared to life, the dashboard light steady and bright as if nothing had happened. But he knew better. Something had changed. He could feel it in his bones. The road was different now. The once familiar landscape had become alien, the fields replaced by dense forests that seemed to press in on the road, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grab him. The air was thick with fog, reducing his visibility to mere feet in front of him. But the worst part was the silence. The radio was dead, the static gone, leaving nothing but an oppressive stillness that made his skin crawl. Every bump in the road, every creak of the truck, made him jump. His senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body screaming at him to get out, to run as fast as he could. But where could he go? The road stretched on endlessly, with no signs, no exits, nothing to indicate he was even still in the real world. He was trapped, driving towards an unknown destination with no way to turn back. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights. Red's heart nearly stopped. It was the woman again, standing there as if waiting for him. Her black eyes locked onto his, and he knew there was no escape. But this time, something was different. She wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the fog, were more figures. Dozens of them, maybe more. All standing still, watching him. Their faces were obscured, but he could feel their eyes on him, cold and unforgiving. Panic surged through him, and without thinking, he slammed on the accelerator. The truck roared forward, but as he got closer, the figures didn't move. They just stood there, waiting. At the last second, Red swerved, the truck narrowly missing the woman as it barreled down the road. But the moment he passed her, he heard it, the sound of metal scraping against metal, like claws raking down the side of the truck. The sound was deafening, echoing in his ears as he tried to regain control. But it was too late. The truck veered off the road, crashing through the trees. Branches smashed against the windshield, the world outside a blur of darkness and chaos. Red's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white, as he fought to keep the truck from flipping over. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The truck came to a stop, the engine sputtering before going silent. Red sat there, breathless, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea how long he had been driving, no idea where he was. The forest was silent, the only sound the creak of cooling metal and his own ragged breathing. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. And then, he heard it. A soft whisper, right in his ear. "Welcome home, Red." The whisper sent a shockwave of terror through Red's body, snapping him out of his paralysis. He whipped around, but there was no one there. The cab was empty, the door on the passenger side still closed. But he could feel it. Someone, something, was there with him, watching him. His breathing came in shallow gasps as he fumbled for the door handle. He needed to get out, needed to escape this nightmare. But as he pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air, he realized something horrifying. He was no longer in the forest. The truck was parked in the middle of a desolate town, the buildings around him crumbling and abandoned. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. There was no sign of life, no sound but the wind howling through the empty streets. Red's heart raced as he looked around, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This town hadn't been here before. He was sure of it. But now, it was as if he had driven straight into another world. The silence was deafening, the oppressive weight of the town pressing down on him. Every instinct told him to get back in the truck and drive away as fast as he could, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes drawn to a figure standing at the far end of the street. It was the woman, her black eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She stood there, motionless, watching him. But this time, there was something different about her. Her dress, once pristine, was now tattered and stained with blood. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung limp around her face. Red's mouth went dry as she began to move towards him, her steps slow and deliberate. He tried to back away, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped, helpless, as she drew closer and closer. When she was just a few feet away, she stopped. Her black eyes bored into his, and he could feel the darkness within her reaching out, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating embrace. "You were always meant to come here, Red," she whispered, her voice sending chills down his spine. "This is where your journey ends." Red's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The town was a labyrinth of empty streets and dead ends, and he was its only inhabitant. The woman's hand reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek. Her touch was icy, burning his skin like frostbite. "You belong to us now," she said, her voice echoing in the empty streets. "You can never leave." And with those words, Red felt something inside him snap. The fear that had gripped him so tightly began to fade, replaced by a numbness that spread through his entire body. He was no longer afraid. He was no longer anything. He was just empty. The woman smiled, a cold, lifeless smile, and stepped back. "It's time to go," she said, turning away and walking back down the street. Red watched her go, his mind blank. He knew he should follow her, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, a hollow shell of the man he had once been. The town began to fade around him, the buildings dissolving into the darkness. The truck, his old Peterbilt, was gone, replaced by a shadowy void that stretched on forever. And then, everything went black. They found Red's truck a few days later, abandoned on the side of the road, miles from any town. The cab was empty, the engine still warm, but there was no sign of Red himself. The only clue was a single sentence, scratched into the dashboard with a shaky hand. "The road never ends." The police searched the area, but Red Matthews was never found. His disappearance became just another unsolved mystery, one of many on the lonely highways of America. But the truckers who drive those roads at night, they know better. They tell stories of a haunted town that appears out of nowhere, a place where the lost souls of the road are drawn to their final destination. They say that if you drive too long, too far, you might just end up there too. And once you do, there's no turning back.